Hi, this is Philosophy 70, and today we start the section on social and political philosophy. We wrapped up ethics with exam 3, so we're moving into this brand new section, which is a lot like ethics, except ethics concentrates on the individual, whereas social and political philosophy concentrates on the group. So you can say it's like ethics, but for a larger group. We often lump social and political philosophy together, but there are differences. Social philosophy would come first because social philosophy asks questions like, should we have society? Right? I mean, that's a fundamental basic question, right? Should we even have a society? Then it would go on to ask, if we have society, what should it be like? Should we have everybody equal? Or should we have a real stratified where some people get all of the rights and some people have all of the responsibilities and there's a lot of inequality? Should we have leaders? Or should everyone have an equal say and there be no leaders whatsoever? Whatever it is that we decide, then what our society should look like. That's an important question. Should we have society? What should it look like? What should it be like? Once we answer those questions, and we usually answer them, yes, we want to have society. Although we'll see one philosopher who says now society is foreign to us, it goes against our nature. But most philosophers will say, yes, society is a good thing. So once we decide we have society, then we move into political philosophy, because political philosophy is about how to run the state or the society. State is a term that we use for any large group of people that's under a central authority. In other words, it's not like what we here have in the United States, where we have different areas that are called states with borders and so forth, and then they are united into a country. The state, as the way we use it in political philosophy, can be a city-state. It can be the country itself. There are a lot of different sizes and ways to explain what the state is, but essentially this is the definition of the state. It's a group of people who are under a central authority. That makes them a state. So once we have a state, so we've decided to have society, we have to figure out the politics of what are we going to do? Are we going to have someone in charge? Who's in charge? How do we do that? Do we select them, or is it something that, well, through force or money and power, they take control? I had a student several years ago who said that she voted for Arnold Schwarzenegger for the governor of California because she thought he was cute. That should not be criteria for selecting your leaders, right? And of course, that turned around and bit her in the ass because he took office and raised tuition from, I think it was $13 a unit to $46 a unit for the community colleges. So, ouch, right? Anyway, how do we have leaders? Again, do we select them? Who selects them? Is it a small council? Is it a large group of people? Does everyone get a say in it? Just so many different ways to come up with a leader. Again, including things like people with a lot of money or power who seize authority or seize power of the state. So the next question then in political philosophy would be, okay, we've got someone in charge, however that came to be. What obligates us to listen to them? Why do we follow them? Well, if you stop and ask yourself now, why do we follow the rules? Why do we follow the laws? The answer that most often comes up is we want to avoid punishment, right? We don't want the speeding ticket, so we go the speed limit if we think that there might be a cop around. We try and follow laws because we don't want punishment. Now, if you think back to last lecture when we were talking about Carol Gilligan and Kohlberg's scale of moral development, the lowest form of moral development was that you do the right thing in order to avoid punishment. So what does that say about us as a society? We might be needing a little growth. There are other reasons why we should obey the laws. You know, it doesn't have to be just because we don't want to be punished. There could be reasons to follow the laws, like it is better for us, it's better for society, it's safer. Laws are there for a reason. You know, it makes sense. We use our rationality, all of those different kind of things that say, look, in order to have a good society, we all need to follow the rules. And you probably recognize that to a certain extent yourself. You know, you expect people to follow the rules. When you pull up to a four-way stop with your car, you pull up, you expect the other people to stop at their stop signs. If they don't, crash boom, right? Because they run the stop sign. Or if you don't stop, you might hit somebody else. We expect people to follow the rules. We need people to follow the rules. But yet, for some reason, most people think it's okay if they themselves don't follow the rules. I don't want people to drive and text at the same time, right? It's dangerous for everybody. But yet, I want to be able to text and drive at the same time. It's just how we seem to be when it comes to following rules. We are not fully morally developed. So that means sometimes that the lawmakers need to really clamp down on us and make harsher punishments. We have one philosopher who's going to say we need to have absolutely horribly harsh punishments because it's the only thing that's going to keep people in line. So we have the state, it has some sort of authority. We'll figure out how that happens. And we need to ask further questions like how far can the government go in restricting our liberties? Can the government sell us into slavery, or can the government just execute us because they think we don't need to live, whatever it might be? We also need to look at things like concepts like justice and liberty and human rights. So we ask questions like, is justice equal distribution? So everybody gets the same amount of money? Or is it equal treatment? Do we have rights that can't be taken away? Is justice whatever the group decides? And that's a really dangerous one because we actually wind up working on that a lot. We decide through the group that this is what's just, and then we do all sorts of terrible things. We have enslaved people, we have murdered people, and we've said, well, yeah, but we think it's okay, so it must be okay. Okay. So questions like, how do we remedy past injustices? We know Native Americans, we know people from Africa have had some terrible injustices done to them by people from this country or people coming to this country. And so how do we rectify that? Can we? Lot of interesting questions. I think this is a pretty interesting time to be asking a lot of these questions too. So we'll talk about all of them. And we're going to start with Plato. We start with Plato um, not because he was the first to think about politics or talk about politics, but he gives us a really laid out answer to all those questions. You know, he tells us why we have a society, who should rule, why we follow, how we select the leader, all of those things. And so it's a good starting place, although it's not without its own problems. So first of all, he says that the state is a natural development. It's based on the human need for other humans. So we want to be together, we need to be together, and so we come together and form society. The layout for politics is from your reading from Plato's Republic, which was part of his Plato's middle period. And it's a book, I may have mentioned this before, that is primarily about Socrates' quest for a good definition of justice. He makes his best effort to finding a definition for justice in this section. But in doing so, he actually winds up giving us a layout for politics, for the just state. So Socrates is talking with Glaucon and Adamantu, and they are trying to figure out what justice is. And Glaucon says, well, I don't know exactly what justice is, but I think that even a just man, an honest man, would do an injustice if he could get by with it. Socrates says, no, no, injustices are only done from ignorance. And so Glaucon and Socrates kind of throw this back and forth and argue about it a little bit. And Socrates says it's done out of ignorance because people who do injustices don't realize how much it hurts their soul. They don't recognize the damage done to their soul. And the damage done is permanent. And since the Greeks believed in reincarnation, you carried that damage with you life after life, which was a problem. You're, living, starting a new life with a damaged soul. Then what are you going to do? You're going to damage it more? Well, if you're ignorant and you don't realize you're damaging yourself, you will do an unjust thing. And Glaucon says, yeah, maybe, but I think it's more profitable to be unjust. And so he's talking about, like, you're holding the scale to weigh out some vegetables, and you're the merchant, and maybe you have your thumb on the scale a little bit, or it's weighted a little bit different. So you charge your customer more for those vegetables, and it's an injustice, but you make more money. So he says it's more profitable than to be just. So they almost hit a loggerheads here, where it's like, well, and we're talking about the soul, and we're talking about profit, and those are two different things. And so Socrates finally says, maybe we can figure this out if we expand our example. Instead of looking at the justice in a person, what if we look at a just state? What makes up a just state? Let's try and make a just state. So Glaucon says, okay, I'm up for that. And they set out to design the perfect state, the perfect city. And Socrates says, well, do you think that it is better for everyone to do a little bit of the necessities in life, or should people specialize? Glaucon says, well, I think it's better to specialize. And Socrates says, yeah, definitely. Because if you spend your time, like I spend a little bit of time over here making shoes, and then I'm trying to take care of the animals, and then I'm over here weaving cloth, and then I'm over here maybe cooking, whatever, I'm going to not be fully completing the job, and I'm not going to be fully specialized in terms of my skills on those jobs. So Socrates and Glaucon agree that it would be better to have a society made up of people that Socrates calls artisans. They are skilled people. So, for example, maybe I'm a shoemaker, and so I spend my days making shoes for everyone, and I trade them. So I trade my shoes to somebody who weaves cloth, and then I get high quality cloth because they are specialized and an artisan in that, and they get high quality shoes because I'm a specialist in making shoes, and so forth. So we trade a lot of things, and maybe then I make shoes and I trade for other things that I might trade to someone else. So I'm going to trade them to the butcher who doesn't need shoes right now, but he needs cloth. So then I trade that for food. So, I mean, you can see how that would work. Everybody specializes in their job, does what they are suited to do. That's going to be the most efficient state, because everybody's doing something that they are good at, that they have developed skill at doing, and hopefully something that they like. I make shoes because I like making shoes more than I like weaving cloth. Or perhaps I was born into a family of shoemakers, and of course I take on the family trade. So Socrates says, yeah, that's it. We need a society of artisans. And Glaucon is kind of shocked and says, well, wait a minute here. You've left out a whole lot of stuff. And Socrates says, I'm meant to. I think we need to have a society of artisans who are making the necessities of life. And Glaucon says, you have the necessities covered, but you don't have what he calls the relishes. We would call them perks, right? So Glaucon says, look, you don't have people that are going to be, making jewelry. They're just going to make tools. Or you have bakers that are making bread. But what about having bakers that will make sweet things and treats? What about decorative shoes or decorative cloth that is being woven? The things that people want, the luxuries. And Socrates says, yeah, I left that out on purpose. I don't want those things um, because do you see my dog there? There she is. Okay. She hears me talking and comes on in. Anyway, sorry about that. So Socrates says, I don't want there to be these luxuries, because if we do, then we have to have a bigger society. Glaucon says, yeah, well, no one wants to live in your society. It might be efficient, but nobody wants to live there. So he says, we need to work on this. And reluctantly, Socrates says, okay, let's see what we can do. Well, if we have people who are specialized in making things like jewelry or cakes, and people who are storytellers or musicians, or some of these luxury kind of professions, then we're going to need a larger society, because we've got the group of people who provide all the necessities. Now we have a larger society because it's people providing the perks. And of course, if somebody is making jewelry, they're going to need to trade for shoes, and so we need more shoemakers and so on. And essentially what Socrates is saying, our state becomes bigger and bigger. And as it becomes bigger, then we're going to have problems, because there will be maybe other states that will want to come and take from us. We might get invaded, or perhaps we think we want more land, or we need more land, so we need a military to go out and take it from someone else. We're going to need protection. We're going to need essentially a police force and a military. So at this point, Socrates says we have to add a second class of people. We had artisans, and then above that, we're going to have what he calls the auxiliary guardians. I'm just going to call them guardians. So we now have the guardians, but now that we have the guardians, and we've just added several hundred or thousands of people to our society, we need a whole lot more artisans, because the artisans will provide the guardians with shoes and clothing and food and tools and weapons and animals and everything that they need. What the guardians are providing back to the artisans is protection. So the guardians don't actually make anything. They consume, but they give back protection. It's supposed to be an equal, and it seems fairly equal type of exchange. But as our auxiliary group grows and grows in order to give or supply the needs that the guardians have, we now have problems with guardians and that group getting larger as well. So we need a third group, a group he calls the rulers. Um, so the rulers would be a small group. Might be a dozen or a handful, might be more than that, but it would be essentially a small group, because they are so special in their job that they're the only ones qualified to do it. So the rulers are above the guardians, and the guardians protect and take care of the artisans. But the artisans down here wind up providing all of the goods, all of the food and everything for not only the guardians, but for the rulers. Even the housing is provided. So the rulers and the guardians don't really own anything. It's all provided to them in exchange for their work at guarding and ruling. So it seems good, and Glaucon agrees that these three classes are necessary. But then, of course, the question comes up with, well, how do we know who's in what class? Because wouldn't, like, most people be like, hey, I want to be a ruler. I want to be a ruler. Um, so Socrates says, well, that's fairly easy. Everybody has three parts to their soul. They have a part that is driven by reason, they have a part that is driven by spirit, and they have a part that is driven by appetites. And depending on which part of your soul rules you, you are in one of the different classes. So if your soul is governed by reason, well, you should be a ruler. It makes sense. We want rational, reasonable rulers. If you are driven by spirit, well, we want you to be a guardian. You should be a guardian. Your soul is suited to going out to fight. And if you have the lowest form of the soul, the appetitive simply means you're driven by appetites. That basically your soul wants you to, eat, drink, sleep, have a lot of sex, party all the time, but you do your job, your skill, but it's kind of you're fighting your soul that wants to just party. So the artisans are driven by the appetitive soul. We look at the type of soul that you have and say, you should be a ruler. Oh, this whole group over here is, they should be guardians, and maybe a couple of folks over here should be artisans, or whatever the group you fall into. Depending on the side of your soul that is dominant, because it has three sides, you must develop a virtue that goes with that particular part of your soul. So the rulers who are driven by reason must develop the virtue of wisdom. Guardians who are driven by the spirited soul must develop the virtue of courage. Artisans who are driven by the appetitive side of the soul must develop the virtue of temperance. Temperance simply means control of the appetites. So if you're an artisan and you're driven by your appetites, you would learn the virtue, you would develop the virtue of becoming temperate, which means you know when it's okay to indulge and when it's not okay to indulge. Otherwise, you're just living according to your appetitive soul, and you haven't developed the virtue. Okay, we wind up then with here a group. Okay, so here's the little chart for you. We have the three classes. Oops. Rulers, guardians, and the artisans, who are driven by their respective souls of reason, spirited, and appetitive, and then the respective virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance. You'll see over here there's one more column, and that is a metal: gold, silver, and bronze. So I'll leave this up for a sec if you want to copy it while you're talking, or while I'm talking. Once they set up the class, the soul, and the virtues, and they said, okay, that sounds good. The people who are ruling should rule. Why do we follow them? Well, we don't have wisdom. It makes sense, right? So we understand all of these things now. We've answered a lot of the political questions. But then Glaucon comes up with a question. He says, how are you going to get people to go into those different classes? Again, most people would want to be a ruler. And so Socrates says, we're going to tell them the noble lie. The noble lie is a term that comes up now with Socrates, but it is used throughout history. And there is a particular noble lie that Socrates tells you, which I'll tell you in a minute. Then there's just the term noble lie. The term noble lie means this. Okay. The noble lie is any lie told by the government in order to benefit the people. So the noble lie is any lie told by the government in order to benefit the people. So the government lies to us sometimes because it is better for us. Maybe they're trying to protect us. Maybe um, they are trying to stop us from panicking, whatever it might be. The idea is that it's called a noble lie because the government does it in order to protect the people. It's in our best interest. So we are talking about the government, not the lie that you tell your friend in order to make them feel better or whatever it is. This is from the government. Okay? So the particular noble lie that Socrates says we should tell in order to get people to follow this political system. He says, we're going to tell them that in between lives when they were down in the earth being cooked, that different types of metal were mixed in with them. So the rulers got gold mixed in with their souls. The guardians got silver mixed in with their souls. And the artisans got bronze mixed in with their souls. Your soul and the job that you have, so the class that you're in, right? All of that then, according to this noble lie, is determined by the type of metal that you have mixed in with you. Obviously, this is going to be something that would be difficult to implement from a perspective of let's start a new society, right? If you've got a large group of people and you say, we're going to restructure society, again, it's going to be so difficult to go through and say, you're gold and you're silver and you're bronze, and these are the jobs that you have to do. So this plan that he has really only works if you're starting from scratch with very few people. But he presses on. They discover or they decide that that noble lie will work and people will be in their right class. Socrates then goes on to say, the worst injustice that a person could do would be to step out of their class and try to do the job that they're not suited for. Okay. So, for example, if an artisan decided that they wanted to be a guardian or a ruler, that wouldn't work because the artisan doesn't have the type of soul. So the artisan who tried to be a guardian would fail at the job terribly and probably get slaughtered in warfare very soon. Same with an auxiliary or a guardian trying to be a ruler. He or she would be very bad at making those decisions because they don't have the rational soul and they're not they haven't developed the wisdom virtue or the virtue of wisdom. So it works the other way as well. If a ruler tried to make shoes, for example, they would probably not make good shoes, right? So you do what you are suited to do according to your soul, and to try and do something else, to step out of your class and do a different job, is the most unjust thing you could do. So the just state, he defines, because remember they're trying to figure out what justice is when everybody stays in their class and does their job according to their soul. If that happens, we have a just state. Things run smoothly. People are doing what they're supposed to do. Now, a minute ago I said men or women. Here's an interesting point. So for women in ancient Athens, life was awful. Essentially, women's role was to take care of the kids, run the household staff, and maybe cook the meals, those kind of things. Um, they didn't have any rights. They didn't have any vote or say in government or anything like that. So what happens as Glaucon and Socrates are talking is that Glaucon says, well, if people are put into their classes according to their souls, what if a woman has a gold soul? A soul that is driven by reason. What happens then? And Socrates says, well, this is the thing that's probably going to get me laughed at. This is the thing that people will surely scoff at. But if a woman and it's a big if, but if a woman has a gold soul, a rational soul, then she should be trained as a ruler. If she has a silver or spirited soul, she should be trained as a guardian. And if she has a bronze or an appetitive soul, she should be an artisan. And Glaucon does laugh. I mean, he says this is ridiculous. You can't have women as rulers. But Socrates explains it's about the soul. So if you are born with a particular dominant side of your soul, you shouldn't waste that. If you have a rational soul, you should be employed as a ruler. You should use that part of your soul. Now, as they look at it, they say things like, well, male rulers are higher than female rulers. But when it comes to ruling, female rulers would be higher than, say, a silver or male guardian. So you would have it still very stratified. You'd have male ruler over female ruler, who is over male guardian, who's over female guardian, who is over male artisan, who is over female artisan. So you've got a real stratified system here, a lot of hierarchies, but this is one of the very first written about societies where women could be rulers. This society that they're describing never comes to fruition. It never gets put into place. But it's an interesting idea that he puts forth that women could be rulers. Some people want to say that because of that, Plato is the first feminist, but let me tell you that's just wrong. What's actually going on is that Glaucon has pushed him into a corner and says, if a woman has a gold soul, and if everything depends on the type of the soul, what are you going to do? The only thing that Socrates can answer is to say, then she must be a ruler. She has to be. So he is just trying to back up something that he didn't quite get a handle on earlier. The other thing that we know that we can say why Plato was not a feminist is because he says a lot of things about women that just don't hold up. For example, he says that women are the result of cowardly men. In other words, he says men, the souls and men, are made by the gods, but a woman is the result of a man who lived a life before and was cowardly. And now he is reborn into the body of a woman because that fits his cowardly soul. So, I mean, that almost excludes the idea that a woman would be reborn with a gold or rational soul. He also says things like women are inferior in every way. I mean, it's just he is actually not a feminist. He is a misogynist. But Socrates is trying to cover his ass when he gets pushed into. But what if there is a gold-souled woman? So we wind up with a political system outlined here. We still don't have a solution to the question, what is justice? We have an idea of what justice is to a certain extent. In other words, he says, injustice is when people step out of their classes and try to do something they're not suited for. So how does that then get to the just person? What's been trying to happen throughout the Republic is people are trying to answer the question, or Socrates is trying to answer the question, what is justice? So he winds up saying, justice is when people follow the right side of their soul. Okay, so it's not a real good answer. He says it's when people recognize that the rational side should be the main side of the soul that's in charge. But since we have three sides of the soul, the tripartite soul is what he calls it. Since we have three sides, we can follow the dominant side, but we always have to remember that reason should be in control. So if I'm an artisan and I like to make shoes, but I also like to party a lot, right? I have to recognize that even though this is the strongest part of my soul, I do have a rational side of the soul, and it will be the thing that tells me when I can party and when I have to make shoes. So he says, when that person has that kind of relationship in their soul among the three sides, then that's justice in the person. It's not a good answer. It doesn't give us, it doesn't give us clear cut answers for what that virtue is. I mean, we have definitions for courage and temperance and wisdom, but we just don't get a good one for justice. The entire book, The Republic, is dedicated on trying to find justice. And we get this, well, it's proper functioning. Everything's working okay. And it's kind of a weak answer. We never really get a good answer from the Republic as to what is just and what is unjust. So that's unfortunate. But that does wrap up Plato. I want to say one more thing about that before I move on to Aristotle. Plato, or Socrates, does have this one quote I like. He says, until philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, there will be no justice. And what he means is, until the philosophers who have the wisdom of things like the forms and who are deep thinkers, until they understand, until those philosophers who do understand become the kings or the rulers, there won't be justice. Either that or the kings who have the power have to understand and become philosophers, so they will recognize the form of justice. He's saying that without the wisdom of the forms that comes from being a philosopher, all of the rulings that the kings make will or possibly could be wrong. So until there are philosophers who are kings or kings who are philosophers, there will be no justice. Now, as a philosopher whose name is King, I kind of like that idea, but it's his idea of the philosopher kings. He's even willing to say there could be philosopher queens because, again, if a woman has a rational soul, she should and could be a ruler. Okay, I'm going to pause this on my end for a second, and then we'll go on to Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle. Aristotle's Politics. Well, he has a book called Politics, and we actually aren't going to be looking at that. That wasn't in your text. We have some information from Aristotle. This little section on Aristotle is very short, so I'm going to add it in here. But Aristotle, as you know, was a student of Plato. So Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. And he explains the purpose of the state, but not the operation. So he doesn't answer those questions like, how should we form the state? Who's in charge? Those kind of things like Plato did and other theories will try and answer. He says there's a purpose to the state. He says the state is natural. It's based on our human social instinct. We are all born with this social instinct. The social instinct is our desire and our drive to be with other people and to have friends, to have society. He says that the state aims at having self-sufficiency and virtue, but not just to live well. In order to live well, we need other people. Okay, so think about his ethics. How did we become good people, virtuous people, according to this ethical theory? We had to find another person that was virtuous. We had to find a mentor, and then we learn from them, and then we practice it until it became our habit and a character. So this is what he wants the society to be. The society is a place that helps us develop and grow our virtues. So we are looking at developing virtues because we're looking at our leaders who are virtuous role models. Now, there's a concept that's very foreign to us in modern times. Aristotle thought the most virtuous person should be the leader, and they would demonstrate to us how to be virtuous. They would give us, you know, wise decisions, or they would make wise decisions, but they should also demonstrate how to be a good person. So his idea was that if we had a good leader, everybody else would be good as well, and we would kind of upgrade. We would continually get better. Today, Aristotle would be rolling over in his grave because we tend to look at our politicians, and perhaps rightfully so, and say they are not the most virtuous. In fact, we often look at people like politicians as the most corrupt and the most unvirtuous, the most vicious. And so Aristotle would look at how we run politics today and just smack his head and walk away. So he gives us this reason that the state is there to help us grow our virtues. He also explains that the communities or the state develops very naturally. He says there are these four human relationships that happen, and this is how we grow from being individuals into a city. He says first there's the relationship of man and woman. So, if you're thinking about some hypothetical time when people are just roaming the earth, well, you've got males and you've got females, and they may decide to form a couple, a union. So the first relationship is between man and woman. The second relationship is between what he calls the natural ruler and the natural slave. Sometimes he says the natural subject. The idea here is that in every relationship, there's someone of a higher quality or a higher status. So when you're looking at the relationship of men and women, okay, men are the natural rulers and women are the natural slaves. He also says all Greeks would be the natural rulers, and anyone that's not a Greek would be the natural slave. So he's got a little bias going on there. But we have men and women coming together. Then we have the natural ruler and the natural slave. Then the third relationship is that of family. Since men and women have come together, we now have at some point children, offspring, relatives. So we have the third relationship, which is the family. So we've gone from individuals and now we have family. And then families join together to become villages. And that's the final step. Families come together, join together to become villages. The villages join together to become states, and now we have moved from the individual and we have seen the formation of the state. Then he says this really odd sounding thing. He says, but, hold on, the state came first. And you're like, wait a minute, you just spent all this time telling me it's men and women, then ruler and the slave, and then family and villages and state. And now you're telling me that the state is prior to the family? What's going on here? What he says and what he means is that the social instinct that we have basically is the idea of the state. And we have to have the idea of the state first. Otherwise, none of those other relationships would have happened. If we didn't have the social instinct, the idea of the state coming first, then we would never form those other relationships. Men and women would see each other. They'd be like, animals in the forest, right? Maybe they hit it and quit it and gone, go their separate ways, but they wouldn't form relationships. You also then, of course, wouldn't have the relationship of ruler and slave or family. You might have mother-child at some point, but you wouldn't have, what he's talking about in terms of the extended family, which then wouldn't join together because they wouldn't exist to become the villages. So the idea of the state had to come first. The state is part of our social instinct. It's part of that idea. But then in terms of actual physical relationships, we have that list of the men, women, so forth going on to villages. He ties his politics into his ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, pretty strongly. I mean, the state's to is to provide a good life and a full life, which means we have a happy and an honorable life that is lived with virtue and reason. And so we need a place to learn and practice our virtues so we can become virtuous people. So the purpose of the state then is to provide for the development of virtues and what he calls essentially a self-fulfilling or self-sufficient life. In other words, I'm able to provide a good life for myself and others, but it's all symbiotic. We're helping each other. So that's essentially it on Aristotle. I told you it was short. Aristotle again gives us the purpose. It's to help us grow and develop our virtues, and it doesn't have a whole lot of other detail in it. So that wraps up Plato and Aristotle, and next time we'll be moving on to Hobbes and Locke and more political and social philosophy.